Hello and welcome to the third webinar in the series Local Growth and Innovation with the NHS Confederation and the Smart Specialisation Hub. My name is Michael Wood for the NHS Confederation and I'm here with Andrew Bassey-McGowan from the Smart Specialisation Hub.
Hello.
Just as a reminder before we get into today's topic, which is the industrial strategy, this webinar is part of a series being held over 6 months. We're looking at a different thematic issue every month, and these are free webinars, free to join and participate in, and we will publish the slides and the recording afterwards on the website, and the web address you can see there in front of you. So, why did we want to involve the industrial strategy in this series of webinars? Well, actually, if you look at what this government has published of late, Andrew, I would say this is probably the biggest and most vital strategy which we've seen since the election. Would that sound right to you?
I think in this sphere, absolutely. I think what was quite sort of a signal of that was the fact that during the budget announcement preceding week, there were lots and lots of interventions that were effectively held over for the industrial strategy, where normally you would expect primacy to be given to the biggest fiscal event of the year. There were several things where the detail and sort of the meat was put on the bones in the industrial strategy document. Looking at the size of it and the number of interventions announced, it's definitely the most significant intervention of its kind, certainly I think, over the life of this government.
And it's important before we come on to the strategy, just to think what happened 5 days before the strategy came out, which was the budget, as you just mentioned. And I think this slide really does leave us with the one take home from the budget, which is an economy much smaller than we envisaged even 8 months ago, with productivity and growth stubbornly low, in an unprecedented 10 to 15 year time span, which of course has impacted directly on wages, on funded provisions, of course for tax funded services such as the NHS, and for a range of other services. And so the industrial strategy really was the second part of what the government's going to do. We've seen the budget emphasise the problems, and the industrial strategy was that response, I guess, Andrew. You know, if I'm thinking about the long-term ability of the government to try and get our economy back on a better footing.
Absolutely. And it's worth reflecting, as we will do over the course of the webinar, on some of the rationale that underpins that and the structure of some of the measures that are announced in the industrial strategy and how they're meant to catalyse that kind of growth and productivity, that kind of rebalancing of the economy, and the uplift in skills that we'll need to prepare for the economy of the future.
You mentioned the word productivity there, and that is absolutely the problem which the budget identified, and I suppose that sense of what the industrial strategy is built on, how our productivity actually is lagging behind many, if not most, of our OECD partners. Do you want to say a few words about the background to the industrial strategy, Andrew?
Absolutely. I think, as we talked about productivity as being one of the core issues here, and I think whilst there is high productivity in pockets across the country, it's probably fair to say there's quite a long tail of lower productivity. This is balanced across sectors, I think, to an extent, and it's also balanced across regions. There are lots of parts of the country, certainly outside, your stereotypical London and the South East, Mike, as you know, which do basically not have the same degree of productivity output for various structural reasons. And the strategy is designed in part as an intervention to try and address that. As we move towards this sort of post-Brexit paradigm, and we look towards certainly a different future for the UK, I think we can probably say that quite confidently. It's important that we are on the front foot as much as possible, that we're able to be ready for Industry 4.0 and the sort of the skills and technologies of the future, the kind of cross-cutting stuff that will radically change the way we work over the course of the next 20 years or so, if not over a shorter time scale than that. And I think in the context of sort of trying to increase our ability to convert some of the really great research and innovation that we have in this country to real economic outputs, we can see the commitment in the budget and industrial strategy to uplift investment in R&D as a percentage of GDP to 2.4% before 2027. There are certainly some who would call for it to be increased to higher than that. I mean, 2.4% brings us up to level with some of our partners and competitors globally. But these are all really important underpinning rationales for doing some really, really potentially interesting stuff in this kind of sphere.
I mean, historically, we've, I suppose, had a tendency to focus maybe on excellence at the expense of everywhere. And I suppose the EU referendum was that, that pivot point at which the government, and particularly the new Prime Minister, spoke about them two being in parity. I guess at the heart of this strategy, therefore, Andrew, you have that challenge almost of how you balance excellence versus everywhere.
Yeah. No, it's fundamental, absolutely. I think there's sometimes a misconception that it has to be a zero-sum game, and that support of excellence needs to be at the exclusion of place-based growth and vice versa. And I think that's not necessarily true. I think there is certainly stuff that can be done to embed some of the kind of outputs of quality research, of kind of innovation and commercialization of that innovation in local areas and local places that haven't perhaps previously been endowed with it for a variety of, again, structural and historic reasons. I think we'll see a couple of interventions in the industrial strategy that we'll talk about later. Try and square that circle to an extent. And I think maybe it's slightly around considering how we use the word excellence, and whether we talk about absolute international excellence or whether we talk about relative excellence, and whether every new job we create has to be a high GVA job, or perhaps there could be some quality medium GVA jobs. I mean, it's an interesting sort of landscape to interpret at this stage.
But I suppose actually it does come back to how we tackle the regional imbalances in our economy. I mean, we are the most regionally imbalanced economy in the OECD, and I think what's interesting is the strategy draws a direct correlation, doesn't it, between the future of the economy and actually emboldening and enabling place-based leadership.
Absolutely.
Which I think is fundamental.
I think just in the context of Brexit, we talk about the European Structural and Investment Funds and the ERDF funds, which are a part of that sort of hidden wiring sort of structure. Those were designed, obviously, as we know, to help to support less advantaged areas economically. And I think with that sort of financial carrot withdrawn, it's going to be really interesting to see how the strategy and both future interventions like the Shared Prosperity Fund will try and again square that circle and try and ensure that resources and opportunities are distributed fairly across the country.
We've spoken a bit about why does this matter. I think it's hard not to understand the importance for the economy of the long-term impacts of what the government hopes and expects of the strategy. There's some stats there which I think bring to life the graph from earlier about the significant downgrading in growth forecasts.
It's so dramatic to see such a substantial downgrading over the course of such a short period of time. I think it's quite remarkable to go from 2%, as we've sort of set out here on the set of slides, from March to 1.5% in November. It's fairly drastic, and as we can see, the sort of concomitant decrease in tax take as a result of that, if the forecasts, of course, are to come to fruition, is really quite dramatic.
And what's interesting, I suspect, is now there's more of an understanding of the role the public sector plays in this. So if we go back to 2010, and if we look at the formation of local enterprise partnerships, for example, it was absolutely that message that it's the private sector that handles growth. And actually, I think we look at the forecast now, and the public sector has to be at the table when many of the challenging parts of this strategy are discussed. And I think we'll come on to those as we go through.
So yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely, and I think it's really important. Again, the 2.4% GDP invested in R&D, that particular target has to be delivered in large part certainly by business and industry. It certainly can't be left entirely at the feet of government to try and ensure that takes place. But the catalysing and convening power of government and the ability of government to create a degree of confidence going forward and to create a sense of permanence in some of these interventions is absolutely vital. And the public sector locally has such a huge role to play in the sort of furthering of this devolved ambition that local areas have, and the kind of opportunity that they perhaps have to take forward in the light of the strategy. Talking a little bit around the history of industrial strategies, as we've just sort of hinted at in the next slide here. It's quite rare, Michael, I think you know, for a government to commit to produce an industrial strategy nationally. It's usually the case that the interventions are rather smaller scale, and that there isn't a grand overarching ambition around a kind of planned economy, as it were, or a planned set of sectors. I think there's been a nervousness around being seen to pick winners. We've certainly been historically sensitive to that accusation in this country. I think also the sense we're not looking to pick losers either as well. I think it's important that at least in as practical a sense as possible that we don't sort of over-intervene. So I think what's quite interesting is that we find ourselves now in a position, we find ourselves at this kind of junction between sort of productivity growth conundrum and trying to solve that, and a larger scale 255-page document is a statement of intent towards trying to accomplish that, I think, and certainly one that is an historical outlier in this context.
And I suppose you mentioned the length of the document there.
Have you read it?
I have read it, and I'm probably in the minority there. I suppose people expect a strategy to have a clear set of targets or aims and objectives. And my sense in reading it was just the sheer breadth of what was included, Andrew, and that's the variance in terms of, how concrete some of these actions are, how short-term, medium, long-term some are, and actually that concept of how you can bring together such breadth into, into a governmental program is incredibly challenging.
No, absolutely. I think that you make a really, really salient point there around the different timescales, I think, that are set against some of the interventions. I'm aware that we just keep talking about interventions. we will talk about them. We're teasing people. But I think it is really interesting. I think one of the major problems that affects confidence is short-termism. And I think there is a perception, rightly or wrongly, often rightly, in some people's views, certainly mine, that the sort of cyclical nature of the way we govern our country leads to some interventions only lasting the lifetime of the Parliament. And certainly in the larger corporate world, at local public sector level as well, people like to take a slightly longer term view. So I think it's interesting to see that this industrial strategy does have some quite short-term life of this Parliament stuff in there. But there are also some slightly grander and broader ambitions around gearing up for kind of the different paradigm that we've talked about. And I think that's quite interesting. There is an attempt here to be sensitive to the needs of everybody really in the sort of the innovation and science and industrial community, and an attempt to really play to some of the needs that people have for this sort of longer term confidence, and at the same time to give a bit of voice to some shorter term interventions that really convince people that government is seized of what's happening now, what's needed to be done now.
On the slide there are a few bullet points, just some highlighted aspects we've brought out. The first point is very interesting, and again comes back to that last issue actually, which about the range and breadth. Significant new programs of funding and financing outlined throughout the document actually. Now, perhaps a lack, there's certainly not one pot of funding that will be centralised and coherently planned, but lots of different financing out there which LEPs, universities, industry, and certainly in the health sector will be interested in. You've mentioned in particular the Strength in Places Fund. Is there anything you can say about that?
Absolutely. The Strength in Places Fund is £115 million over, I think, 3 years to essentially support interventions at local level, a competitive fund to be bid into by LEPs, by universities, by commercial actors, essentially with a driver both to support excellence and to promote growth. And I think it's important at this stage to note that there are elements of this fund that are still, I believe, under design, so I wouldn't like to overcommit in terms of how it will eventually be shaped. But it's certainly there to draw on local strengths, to draw on local assets and local intelligence. So obviously obviously we're very interested from a smart specialisation hub perspective. Our last webinar, of course, was on the science and innovation audits, and in the industrial strategy itself, it's made explicitly clear that the audits will play a part in that evidence gathering process, which I think is really encouraging, because it means that whilst there isn't necessarily a huge pot of money around the audit process itself, it does show the government is taking this sort of local bottom-up evidence gathering process seriously, and it is worth being around the table when these decisions are being made and these pitches are being put in. Simply because if you're not, then things will get forgotten and passed by. So it's a really interesting attempt to, as we mentioned earlier on, try and square off excellence, whether that be absolute excellence, relative excellence, and the needs of places, and to try and ensure that there is this sort of economic uplift agenda that sits behind all of these decisions, that growth and productivity are always kept in mind when funding decisions are being made. So it's an interesting set of drivers behind this, and I think it's going to be really, really fascinating to see how it plays out, to see how the fund design will work, and to see how allocations will be made and the competition will be run. So, yeah.
And as with several of these new funding commitments, actually, you're right, the detail is still being worked upon. So more information as we understand, as we find them out. The Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund is something we've known about for a while, and some money is already committed in various areas. But it strikes me that this is going to be an important source of funding going forward across a whole range of strategic areas.
Absolutely. I think we can read them against the grand challenges as well in some ways. There are strategy challenge fund sectors that you can almost assign to some of the grand challenges and say, okay, I can see where this alignment sits. There's been a bit of thinking that's gone into this, and there's logical flow through. So I think that makes some sense. I think it's over 720 million extra going into the ISCF. I think so. That's wrong. Apologies. but that's how I understand it. So I think that does point to increasing support for innovative activity, increasing support for the commercialisation of that activity, and ensuring that certain innovations, certain sort of attempts to do things don't get lost by the wayside. I think that's quite important. The British Business Bank has also been endowed with an extra 2.5 billion for various pieces of activity, which we leveraged against private sector investment, I think, to raise 7 billion in total over the life of this specific fund. So we will see how that bottoms out and how it can be used.
And we'll come on to the life science sector deal, where again there's a strong reference to the work of the Business Bank to leverage and to make sure that it's both industry and the government that are at the table in partnership in trying to underpin the industrial strategy. A really important point on this slide, Andrew, is those local industrial strategies, and it would be very different given the breadth of this long-term strategy if it was all done nationally. But of course, but the industrial strategy is a mixture of empowering the economy and enshrining the place. And I'm really excited and interested in how local industrial strategies develop and what their focus is on.
Absolutely. I think we've been waiting for a while for the other shoe to drop on this a little bit, because I think it's been a suggestion out there in sort of the local sort of economic landscape that industrial strategies might be the way to go, certainly for labs. There's been some activity by lots and lots of labs to refresh their strategic economic plans, and others have decided to take a slightly different route and to adopt industrial strategies quite early on. I've been in the room with a few labs as they've sort of grappled with this and thought, where should we go? This is obviously in advance of the strategy publication, and it's been quite interesting to see a few labs sort of independently have arrived at a couple of grand challenge themes, say, as priorities they'd like to identify going forward to sort of do on a local level. So I think looking forward to seeing how they take that ownership forward in this context. I mean, it's a great time for them, I think, in many ways, because it really empowers them to take a bit of leadership here. And it does speak completely to sort of the ongoing devolution of responsibility and the ability to bid into funding pots and to spend them in a slightly more discretionary way. What will certainly be interesting is when you look at how industrial strategies will be managed and finally owned and delivered, a lot will depend on how local governance is structured in a particular place. And I think the industrial strategy refers to mayors having ownership in some places, combined authorities and others, and LEPs in others as well. So there's lots of conversations being had, lots of people at the table. I think everybody should be given the chance to input, because again, it's a great chance to sort of influence and really take a prominent role in the design of what is effectively a really, really potentially architecturally vital document, and set of priorities for our local area.
And some immediate questions spring to mind in talking about local industrial strategies. You mentioned the SEPs, strategic economic plans. And I suppose there's a sense about how different local industrial strategies will be to a SEP. And an industrial strategy, it cannot just be a bidding document.
No, absolutely.
And likewise, it can't just be a marketing document for a region. It's got to ask the right questions of a place and provide that leadership to make a success of the strategy at a local level. So it'd be fascinating to see how the process of getting the right people around the table and of getting to a local strategy, and we expect the first ones to be agreed by March 2019. There's still some time. You know, and just how that process differs and how we've had it in the past few years, I suspect will be a really interesting point.
I think so. And I think it's the Science Innovation audits have been a learning process, I think, where they've taken place, because there may have been an understanding quite early on amongst some people that the audits were intended as bidding documents, that there would be a funding pot explicitly at the end of that particular collective experience, shall we say. But I think one of the great takeaways from that is that it's encouraged people to work in that collaborative way and to reflect on having an evidence base and having a set of identified communal strengths almost, that everybody can sort of get around the table on, that everybody understands, and that everybody can see the need to mutually support. And I think that's absolutely vital. So the audits have helped with that learning process. I think what we won't get with the industrial strategies, the locally owned ones, is what perhaps we saw in some of the 2013 SEPs, because some of those 2013 SEPs did read a little bit like bidding documents, and that's not in any sense to deride or diminish the work of the LEPs concerned. It may have been around the steer they were given, it may have been around the time they were given to assemble them, and let's be honest, they were being asked to do this quite early on in their lifespan. But I think we're now at a point certainly in the kind of life cycle of the LEPs as organisations, and in terms of the sort of the governance structure that's being devolved to the country, to really start to see interesting work being done on the ground, and all the right people coming around the table. Another piece of SIA learning actually that came up in a conversation I was having last week is increasingly at local level people are talking about collaborations in the context of, oh, let's do this the way we did the SIA. So I think if that kind of collaboration is being promoted and being understood better, and that it's a more proactive and engaged process, then that can only be good.
And the fact that LEPs were in the driving seat was another clear steer from the strategy. It speaks about a review of the LEPs, which we expect to, I think, report in springtime next year, but it commits the chairs of the LEPs to sitting around the table with the Prime Minister on a biannual basis, and where there isn't a mayoral combined authority, LEPs are very clearly the organisation the strategy puts in the leadership, which I think is a really interesting message, Andrew, which you know really restates the fact that we need to know our LEPs, and we need to be talking to them about the value the public sector brings to local growth plans.
Absolutely.
What we thought we'd do is just reflect on, I suppose, the mechanics of the strategy. In particular, the strategy, when published, speaks about 5 foundations of productivity. We spoke about productivity challenge the country faces and how this strategy aims to address that. The industrial strategy green paper, published in January 2017, had 10 pillars.
And now, architecturally, we're not going into the foundations.
And now we've halved that, and we're going into the foundations.
Deeper.
So we have 5 foundations. We'll go through them in a second. They are ideas, people, infrastructure, business environment, and places. Now, as well as these, a really novel, interesting aspect, which you've already touched upon, Andrew, was the grand challenges. And there's 4 of the grand challenges. And for a health innovation audience, I think very much of interest, very relevant. The 4 grand challenges are AI, artificial intelligence and data economy, clean growth, future of mobility, and the ageing society. Perhaps, shall we start on the grand challenges? Sure. Andrew, and I think my understanding of the grand challenges, we're facing both ways here. We're facing a world of new markets, new global markets. How can we enter and lead these markets and shape new innovations, and of course help our industry and our PLC of the UK, but also actually fundamentally, how can we address the services we provide and make them fit for purpose for the future world? So I take ageing society as a classic example, where yes, there is a need to understand innovations which help the provision of services and which unlock new markets related to the ageing society, clearly a global issue. But also what's interesting is the industrial strategy talks about the forthcoming social care green paper as actually just enabling different business models to develop in social care. And I think there's a really interesting, facing two ways there, of the new innovations, the new global markets, but fundamentally dragging our public services into the 21st century.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really, really good reading of it. And I think it will making it happen will live in an understanding of that everywhere. Everybody sort of grasping that, as you say, we're not just looking towards positioning ourselves in what will be necessarily a huge growth market globally, but that there is such a fundamental infrastructure-based role for local NHS actors certainly and others to play in making sure that we have this supportive network almost. In a sense, there's no good developing cross-cutting tech and applications of the future that will be immensely and fundamentally marketable globally if we don't sort of fix the roof, as it were, at the same time.
Yeah, and the partnerships which these grand challenges will stimulate, I think it'll be fascinating. I mean, the government absolutely wants to use the term challenges to get people around the table. That's the private sector, the public sector, or universities and research institutions.
And civic society as well.
And civic society is such a fundamental part of that equation. So from an innovation perspective, these four areas here, you would expect lots of those new funding pots and programs to be stimulating work in those four areas. You would expect local industrial strategies to where there is that local element of need or strength to be focused in these areas. And I think it really does enable us to think about the question from a different perspective, Andrew.
No, absolutely. I think this is a real call to action for everybody to really come together around the table. And I think the civic society point is really interesting as well, actually, especially in the context of an ageing society, because I think there's a universality to it. It's so rare that you have documents of this nature even acknowledge the need for a kind of investment in human capital and a need of investment from the public at large in this kind of endeavour. You can't really get this done without some significant buy-in. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's and the areas chosen are exciting from a health perspective. Of course, AI and the data economy, data-driven economy, important for health and social care. Things such as a new government office for AI being established, the new Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, looking at the regulatory landscape, looking at how we enable and share ethical and innovative use of data. I think there's some philosophical questions there which actually we have often struggled with as a sector. And I think that the ability to take these issues in a totality is something which will benefit us. And interestingly, clean growth, I know many colleagues in the health service fully aware of the scale of the carbon footprint of the NHS, and it's very difficult in a service with huge estates where capital money has been very tight recently, to actually make use of and utilise and put ourselves as a service at the forefront of the clean growth agenda. And actually I think there's huge potential for us to be more involved in this and to unlock the savings, I think, for the service which will come out of that, but also, of course, cutting down on our carbon footprint is a good thing.
There is one sort of maybe a still point here, one that is quite important to to acknowledge, certainly from government, I would just flag, is that policies across the board need to align with these ambitions. I think it's good to have a strategy that emphasises the importance of these different challenges and the foundations of productivity that will help to support them. But everything needs to be pointing in the same direction for it to work. So you look at something like clean growth, for example. There are many actors at play in the government landscape when it comes to this kind of priority. And I think it's important that everybody is fully seized of the need to kind of do this cohesively. And I think the proposed sort of cross-government body to look at how the industrial strategy is implemented has a very important role there. And I look forward to seeing how that will be constituted and how it will be empowered going forward. Because I think there is a need to monitor activity and keep people honest effectively in a very kind of abstract sense. I'm implying no dishonesty here. But simply just to ensure that nobody loses sight of the main goal. And I think that's quite important.
And you're absolutely right. Success, or a form of success for the industrial strategy, is by definition cross-governmental, as well as with the other partners at the table. And historically, that's been a challenge to get out of different departmental silos. These grand challenges absolutely cut across those departmental silos. So Whitehall, there's a need for collaborative working on Whitehall as there is elsewhere. If we just focus on the foundations, perhaps, the ideas, the strapline for ideas is to be the world's most innovative economy. Of course, the R&D investments, up to 2.4% of GDP by 2027, as you mentioned before, were heavily trailed in advance in the budget. And there's a raft of money underpinning that in different pots, which will be of real interest to our researchers and our innovators. There's also, of course, the landscape changes with UK research innovation being established from next year. You've mentioned the Strength in Places Fund. So I think there's a lot there for the innovation economy to look at and to understand its value, in that the government is challenging our innovators to actually help it address its own needs and to seek out those global marketplaces going forward.
I think also the uplift in higher education investment fund is another huge signifier towards this. It's been recommended, I think from myriad directions. I think it's good to see it in place, as Joe Johnson has frequently suggested it would be. It's great to see that going down.
If we look at the second one, people, to generate good jobs and greater earning power for all, and a real focus here on the technical education system, which has often struggled for parity, I think, with higher education. I think that's fair to say. And again, industrial strategy talks about the articulation and the launch of T-levels, our institutes for technology, for example. Lots of really interesting skills development areas for the health service at all levels, be that high level, scientific, specialist nature, or be that at entry points to health and care. One thing which really does stick with me are the skills advisory panels, which the government clearly wants to be established in every LEP area. And and this will absolutely look at the local skills provision, which gets local people into jobs in the local economy and the right jobs. And so I think there's a clear call for the NHS to know about this and to be at the table locally. Get around the table when your skills advisory panels are being created. Infrastructure, absolutely a major part of the future of what we can achieve. Andrew, and I know there's talks about increasing the National Productivity Investment Fund. The areas that money will focus on, are we thinking transport, housing, digital infrastructure?
Absolutely. Which is obviously fundamental. I think there is an explicit mention of taking into account disparities in productivity and economic activity and opportunity in different areas, and ensuring investments drive growth across all regions, in as far as that's possible. And I think that is a vastly under-recognised commitment, and I think it's key that commitment is made good on. It really is, because there's a great catalysing effect of kind of nature for those kind of goals in places, and it certainly helps to build confidence, and it helps to build full stop. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that the potential of that is realised.
I think you're absolutely right, and that, for me, that was a standout point. We've seen purely economic decisions being made on infrastructure recently, which has held back many parts of the country, and I think that's hugely important. A focus on the business environment, making the UK the best place to start and grow a business. We'll come on to the main element of that chapter, which is about sector deals, in a minute, with an example of the life sciences sector deal. And last, but certainly for me, by no means least, Andrew, is places. And we've referenced, of course, the local industrial strategies. But again, it absolutely enshrines the place as a unit of change for me. Work of this strategy.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to recognise place as a term in some ways. I think we talked about this a little bit in webinar 1, but it probably doesn't hurt just to very briefly touch on it. It would be a mistake sometimes to regard places as simply LEP areas. I think LEP areas are great, and I think that in many cases they are economically viable for doing specific things, dependent on their own scale and capacity. But there are other interventions that might need to be done at a slightly larger geographic scale, or perhaps slightly smaller. So I think when we talk about place, I think it's important to understand that the place is defined by the place itself, and it isn't necessarily for government to sort of tell people whether they're doing it right or not. So I think that's just something to kind of bear in mind. But it's fundamental that places, however they're defined, bottom up or top down, are empowered to do the right kind of things to make the interventions that have cross-cutting application for everybody that lives in them, really. And
this is the chapter where the Shared Prosperity Fund was mentioned again, which is the replacement for the European Structural Investment Funds. And we wait and see, I suppose, about the detail for this. We're expecting a consultation imminently, I think, Andrew. Is that the latest? Which
absolutely.
Which is incredibly important. You know, we work with our HSNs and others in the health service to make people aware just how many projects the health service has been involved in.
Yeah.
And how important it is that the replacement for ESIF, the Shared Prosperity Fund, understands the value of health to the local economy.
There are a few things around ESIF that are they would be quite helpful if the Prosperity Fund could look to replicate, I think. Certainly the length of the interventions around ESIF are quite good. You have a little bit of certainty around the length of the project, potentially. So people are able to plan with a little bit more certainty. And spend more time on planning, which is always helpful with a detailed project with lots of different actors at the table. I think it's really important to be able to plan properly and avoid some problems arising down the line. I think that's key. ESIF also was very useful in terms of serving the rebalancing agenda, and you can debate the efficacy of that, I think, and look at the figures. And, you know, it's certainly essentially contestable whether it was successful or not, but the cohesion agenda that underpinned it was quite important. I think the Shared Prosperity Fund needs to certainly acknowledge that. And finally, I think ESIF was very helpful through its technical assistance program in terms of ensuring that there would be architectures in place to support people trying to access funding, and sort of to encourage economic uplift in areas. And I think the Shared Prosperity Fund will need to take that into account as well. In an ideal world, I think we can talk about design, and then we can talk about effective management of it down the line, and I'm sure we will. But I think at this point it's really important that the gaps aren't left either in terms of a transitional period or in terms of what ESIF is presently covering. It could certainly be made easier to access, let's say that.
One of the areas we just mentioned there was the sector deals, and we spoke about excellence in everywhere. And in terms of excellence, the government in the Green Paper originally prioritised some industrial sectors where the UK is well known as a global leader. One of those was life sciences, and the Green Paper proposed at the time 5, I think we'll now see that widen going forward, what were called sector deals. And the word deal is important. That's very much the concept of the local growth agenda: city deals, local growth deals, devolution deals. These are deals between the government and between the leaders of that sector. The life sciences sector deal was published last week. It's the first of the new sector deals to be agreed. Other sector deals being worked on include AI and creative industries, and there's a few others as well. The industrial strategy document if you want to look at it, actually sets out a process for new sector deals. And I understand there is great interest from a wide range of industries across the country and sectors to try and sit down with government and hammer out a deal. The partners the deals bring together are absolutely industrial leaders and the government, but also universities, key partners in the case of life sciences, of course the NHS. The government wants the people around the table who it can talk to at a strategic level to talk about how to turn these sectors or to strengthen these sectors into truly world-leading sectors in a post-Brexit world. They're not one-offs, so there'll be a series of phases of the various deals. Certainly in the case of the life sciences sector deal, what has been agreed already is the first phase of many. And as we've discussed throughout, they will be aligned to, in particular, the foundations of productivity. If we just say a few words about the life sciences sector deal, I think because it's of interest, it's an issue clearly of interest to health innovators, but also it gives, I think, a nod to what the sector deals will look like going forward. So Sir John Bell published the Life Sciences Industrial Strategy in August, and that was really a document setting out industry's side in terms of offerings and what it felt it needed to really strengthen the sector's output. The sector deal brings the government response into play. So it's both the government and the industry coming together and locking each other into a deal. It sets out recommendations on how industry can drive growth, increase productivity, improve the use of data, reinforce our science base, deepen skills, and of course benefit our patients. But there's a range of commitments and actions, including investments from both government and industry. And it's clear looking through the deal the parity that government and industry have in terms of what they will do and what they expect from the other. There'll be an annual review of the sector deal this time next year, and there will be an implementation board established to lead the deal as it goes forward. I've just picked out a few points, I suppose emphasising what the government has committed to do and then what industry is committed to do. We've already heard about several of the funding announcements which Andrew mentioned, and clearly the sector deals will make use of these different funding announcements. So the life sciences sector deal will expect to receive some of that R&D uplift. It will expect to receive some of the focus of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. It would expect to receive some of the private leverage the British Business Bank will bring in. So I think clear alignment there between what we've just heard. In terms of specifically related to life sciences, as a nod to what's been happening in America, establishment of a health advanced research program in this country, really, which is looking at long-term health projects around which to collaborate, the ones with clear industrial benefits as well. The government has committed to further investments through the National Institute of Health Research in research infrastructure, and of course to implement any accelerated access review published a few months ago. I think just in terms of looking at infrastructure, investments, a series of investments listed in the sector deal, and again that bring together the place perspective because they're not simply in the Greater South East. We've got the £350 million programme for the MedTech Hub in Leeds referenced, the research work going on at Sheffield Olympic Legacy Park, as well as some allied infrastructure supporting other parts of the sector needs related to housing, for example, in Oxfordshire, or indeed the Cambridge South Station. Other things the government's committed to in relation to people, again, you'll see the direct links throughout to the foundations of productivity here. Talking about immigration rules, speeding up the recruitment of high school students, post-degree, and of course, reducing red tape in higher international researchers. So you start to see how the foundations of productivity have been aligned directly into the sector which the deal is trying to explore. From industry, a series of planned and expected matched investments across the country, a commitment to sitting down with government to collaborate on areas of health research projects agreed between the parties. Again, a really reinforced commitment to collaborating with the NHS to help transform patient services. And in terms of that skills agenda, it's interesting to get industry leading on perhaps understanding what an apprenticeship standard might look like in relation to life sciences. So I think it's interesting because this clearly matters to us, but it's also interesting as this is how the government will work, I think, going forward, Andrew. That I can't emphasise enough that word deal.
No, absolutely. The intent is to bring people to the table and to welcome proposals. And again, it's quite bottom up, and it's really about engagement and involvement. And you know, it's a recurrent theme from our very first webinar. It's the need to be involved, the need to be around the table is so important. I think what's quite significant here is about the life sciences sector deal was so early. It's its priority. It was just imbued with this sense of urgency and this sense of collegiate approach, which I think is really helpful in underpinning it. And I think it's just really, really interesting to see these things start to come to fruition and perhaps form a model for other sectors going forward. There is a danger with sector deals, potentially, that they privilege established sectors to an extent, and that there isn't the opportunity for more emerging technologies that perhaps don't have collective advocacy on their own behalf. They might get left behind, and there might not be as much oxygen for them towards the end of the process. But I think what's quite interesting is that these are quite high-level sectors that we're talking about, and a lot of the cross-cutting stuff that's going to be emergent and will help us to build resilience and diversity into our economy going forward will actually sit beneath all of these sector fields. So the opportunities are still there, even though things might seem to be already in train, things are moving very fast. There's still always a chance to get involved.
Here are just some links for people if they want to have a look at the industrial strategy white paper themselves, if they want to have a look at the life sciences sector deal, or indeed if they want to read the briefing which I published for the NHS Confederation on the strategy. In terms of looking ahead to the webinars coming down the road, we mentioned UK research and innovation as one thing which the strategy spoke about, that streamlining what is a quite complicated research landscape going forward, and of course actually devising the strategy and the process behind many of the funding pots, Andrew. This will be an incredibly important organisation from next April.
Absolutely. Already we're talking about funding pots being given to the UKRI to manage and distribute Shepherd's Prosperity Fund is a case in point. Not Shepherd's Prosperity Fund, sorry, the Strength in Places Fund. So it's quite important that some of the issues that are being grappled with at UKRI are sort of surfaced, and there's public discussion about them. So I think hopefully we can help support that. I know Sir Mark Walport, the Chief Executive Designate of UKRI, has spoken publicly about not wanting to throw away stuff that already works. So it'll be really interesting to see how that all balances out. And towards the start of next year, there's an acceleration to the proper implementation of UKRI. And I think we'll start to see a number of things and people, crucially, fall into place. And we'll be able to start to get a read on exactly how quickly it will get up and running.
And then linked to that, and linked in fact to everything we've spoken about today, February and March webinars looking at the governance of innovation. We've just spoken about the review of LEPS, the role of Metro Mayors, how the industrial strategy really emphasised those to individuals or institutions as being the leader of the place. I think we'll explore that in more detail in February. And then we've spoken about the Shared Prosperity Fund as well. And by March 2018, I'm sure the consultation will be well underway. And I'm sure that myself and Andrew and external colleagues who bring in for that discussion will have more information to share with colleagues. So, thank you. That's it from me. Andrew, I don't know if there's anything else you would like to add at this time. Aside from to say this is still early days in the strategy, we've spoken about the long-term implications of this.
Absolutely. I think people see a white paper and they think, okay, this is it, this is what's happening now, which is absolutely understandable. And I think in the context of a green paper preceding it, and sort of the time lag between the two, you expect a series of programs that are ready to go. And that's not an uncommon expectation, I think. But I think what's quite important to remember is that These are a set of proposals, a set of interventions, a set of promises and commitments in some places. Not all of their design is finalised yet, and I think we've hinted at this throughout the conversation today. There are still things that are, if not up for grabs necessarily, then certainly to be determined. And I think engagement and involvement in that, and certainly the Smart Specialisation Hub, and I know the NHS Confederation are both going to be very active in this space over the course of the coming months, both to make the case for local innovators and NHS actors across the country, but also to feed in some of the expertise and stakeholder feedback that we get. So I think it's still a very interesting time. Nothing is set in stone. Whilst a number of commitments have been made and a number of interventions announced, I think we're in a position where this is where the real stuff happens. This is where the implementation phase starts, and I look forward to seeing how it plays out.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me, Andrew, as ever, and we look forward to speaking to you all again next month. Happy Christmas and a great New Year.
Great New Year, everybody. Thank you.